Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be reviewing Exploring the Unknown by Reegonetti Band.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
Today's episode will definitely be exploring the unknown, seeing as probably no one watching this video right now actually knows this band or who they are, and luckily they're on Spotify because honestly I don't want to pay for another totally obscure album once more. Anyway, here's some of my favorite bits from this album.
You are now floating in oblivion. Please take a moment to read the manual so that you can enjoy your new life. We also recommend you not to expose yourself to bad memories or good feelings.
So today's album of topic is called Exploring the Unknown and it's by Reegonetti Band. And this one has a very interesting backstory to it that kinda made me deja vu because it has a very similar story to yet another one we reviewed on the series, being that of episode 219 where we talked about Castle Canyon's Gods of 1973. And you might remember that the story behind that album was that two friends about in like the 70s wanted to create an album together, so they formed a band called Castle Canyon, but then they didn't manage to actually record the music and the turmoils of life just kinda got them, and then they had to wait up until the 2000s where they grouped up again and recorded their debut album and released it then, pretty much overdue. And well, the story of Reegonetti Band is quite the same. You might even call it the Swedish counterpart to that story as well, seeing as these two Swedes actually met up at around 1980, and then in 1981 they formed this band called Reegonetti Band. And well, they wanted to create an album together, and around 1983 they actually started working on it, but unfortunately, you know, turmoils of life, blah blah blah, stuff didn't work out, and unfortunately it took them all the way up until 2012 to actually start recording this album again. And the two original members of this group were actually keyboardist Ronald Wikström and drummer and vocalist Brøje Reinholdsen. And well, the reasons for the two not recording this album sooner in the 80s were, well, there's two reasons, I guess. The first one is the fact that they wanted to have a guitarist and a bassist in their band, but they just couldn't get any. And the second reason is that they found their music to be overly complex to be actually played on a live stage in a live setting, and thus the album never really came to fruition. And then, as I said, the two went on their own musical endeavors, working in several bands, projects, movie scores, whatever, and then in 2012 they finally got together yet again and decided to try and record a single together, which actually went pretty smoothly. So for the following 8 years the two would go on to record the rest of this album. And this time they still lacked a guitarist and a bassist, but they just kind of went with it in a way, and they decided that they were gonna create the music that they wanted to, even if it was too complicated to be played on stage. And honestly, I totally get them and where they're coming from, and I'm happy that they finally did so. And on February 5th, 2022, they released this album, Alas, and it saw the light of day, being their debut album called Exploring the Unknown. Now you might spot an anomaly with this, seeing as this album came out this year in February 5th, 2022. And well, I didn't add it on the list later on, I just put it on the list back when I made it in 2021, so how did it come about to actually be featured on the series? And well, this is my assumption. I think that someone recommended this album to me, and someone that actually was a part of the creation of this album or knew its creators, because honestly, this one is very obscure. Like, absurdly obscure. And well, it kind of makes sense when you think of it. Someone knew of the existence of this album, but it still hasn't seen the light of day, at least not for the wide masses. So said someone recommended this album to me because I approached many people whom I don't know who they are, and they were like, yeah, you should go listen to this album, but it still hasn't come out yet. And the funny thing about it is that if the Gods of Randomness would have put this one at like January on the list, I would have not found this album. I would just be like, what, someone made this up, and wouldn't listen to it and substitute it by something else. But fortunately, the Gods of Randomness decided that I was gonna listen to this one today, so it's actually out and you can also go ahead and listen to it yourself right now, even on Spotify. And honestly, this album, it's not even half bad. It's actually pretty good in a way. I do feel that it has one major dissimilarity to Gods of 1973 in a way that it doesn't feel like an album composed back in the 70s and released in the 2000s, but instead it feels like a very much educated album that learned from a life full of experience, and it was actually more made in the 2000s rather in the 70s. And I do get that these guys said that they had a lot of sources of inspiration, mainly from Genesis, ELP, and yes, but honestly when I listen to this, what I mostly get is sort of crossover prog, maybe even some neo-prog. Nevertheless, personally, I do believe that this album could be divided into two types of songs, the one being mostly space rock instrumentals and the others being very much accessible crossover prog songs. So when it comes to the actual songs with the lyrics that are very accessible, I personally like them less, and fortunately there aren't that many of them on the album. Specifically, look out for the songs Reach for the Sky, Walking on Dean Street, and Hold On. And especially Hold On, I really didn't like that one. We get some very mild vocals, even bad to some extent, and then we get a duet with the vocalist and another female singer, which just sounds completely off in my opinion. I don't like how it sounds, really not that good of a song, but yeah, I digress. But the rest of this album actually turned out to be some varying degrees of good, some being okay and some being really good actually, with my personal favorite being a song called Dance of the Invisible. But I do believe that the biggest flaw on this album has to be the fact that it tries too much with the little capabilities that it has. Despite whatever grandiose sound the two guys actually are trying to make on here, it is widely apparent that there are only two people performing on here. And the thing is, well, it kind of feels cheap in a way, because there are many times where the keyboards try to emulate a guitar solo, which, as I said, doesn't sound as good as the original. And the other thing is, well, they do feel sort of lacking. And when it comes to actually not being able to perform this on stage, it comes down to the fact that there's just many layerings of keyboards and synths on top of one another, and that's a perfectly understandable thing. But the thing is, it's really not a reason not to perform this live, seeing as artists have been doing this for a while now, and honestly they've just been using playbacks, and that's a perfectly understandable thing to do. And seeing as these two guys probably aren't performing this album too much is quite a shame, because I don't really see a way in which it would actually gain popularity if not from being performed in live shows. But I might be entirely wrong on here. They might perform in many places around Sweden and in the world, and I just don't know, because honestly there's really not a lot of information about this very obscure band. So hopefully they'll come out with some more information about them, and I'll hopefully get to know more of their doings. But overall, I don't find that this album is one of Swedish's prime prog albums. They're definitely a country to produce a lot of good prog bands. This one, not the one that I was expecting to be that good, and honestly it did turn out to be pretty mild in a way. I would say this album is good and it wasn't a bad listen at all. I do believe that there's a lot of room to expand to, but that is what is right now. And if you're doubting yourself on whether even to listen to this album, I would try and describe it as being somewhat similar to the music of No Man, while also trying to be pretentious much like ELP, but of course failing to do so. So this is one of those covers that I particularly dislike. The thing is, it just tries too much in a way, it doesn't really get anywhere with it. This to me at least looks like some sort of a cheap knockoff of what Hypnosis were doing, taking something that is supposed to be realistic and just making it too much in a way and not keeping the simplistic reality side of things in it, and honestly I don't like it that much. And personally on this album I do feel that there's a lot of personality on here, a lot of story to be told, and you can definitely see it in some of the songs, and I think that something that would have reflected it better would have been much more pleasing to the eye. So as it stands right now it might look good, but not a good cover in my personal opinion. So this album just makes me wonder, what's the point really? And well, if I had to give it a what's the point really rating, I'd give it a rating of 7 out of 10. Actually, come to think of it, it's a pretty high rating, so I guess they deserved it because it wasn't that bad of an album to begin with. But anyway, that's about it guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're going to be listening to The Whirlwind by Transatlantic. I of course want to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay, Warner, Wrist of Kings, and Lindsay Haycox. You guys are just the best, and if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my About page. But that's about it guys, have a wonderful day and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye guys.